Today, we're going to talk about intuition. Why do you experience a feeling when you walk into a place that you don't like this restaurant and you want to go to this other restaurant? Or you trust this person, but you don't quite trust that person? Or you might have a sense that something is wrong with your pet or your child, even if you can't articulate what the issue is. So in all these cases, what are the signals that the brain is picking up on? And what fraction of those signals does your consciousness have access to? And importantly, does intuition sometimes steer us wrong? What we call intuition is not something to be trusted automatically. It quite often steers us the wrong way. So what are the features of the situation to look for where you might feel like, okay, my intuition is more likely to be useful here than in this other situation where my intuition is more likely to steer me wrong? And what is the future of intuition as we build new technologies that might take the myriad signals racing around in the darkness of our brains and bodies and bring them to light? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford, and I've spent my career at the intersection between how the brain works and how we experience life. Today's episode is about that gut feeling that we call intuition. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while or reading my books, you've definitely heard me talk about all the stuff that transpires unconsciously in the unconscious mind. This is all the computations we have no access to and really no acquaintance with. So think about how you walk, all the sophisticated coordination of muscles and balance that's required there. Until very recently, that was an impossibly difficult task to get robots to do this. But ever since you were 2 years old or so, you've been doing it just fine. Now, you can't articulate how you walk and how you keep your balance. It's much like riding a bicycle in that way. And presumably, you can do several things while you're walking or riding a bike. You can have a conversation or maybe punch out a text on your phone while you're doing it. But if I ask you to describe to me what you are doing with all that beautiful, sophisticated musculature, it's simply not possible. You put the years of work into learning how to walk and how to ride a bicycle, and it resulted in expertise. But an inability to articulate what was going on there under the hood. And it's like this with most of the actions that you take, whether that's deciding what you want to eat, or who you're going to marry, or how you're identifying a smell from some mixture of molecules, or whatever. You just find that your brain can magically do it because all these operations are happening in silence in the darkness of this vast computational vault. So, your conscious mind is like the broom closet in the mansion of your brain, and all of the rest involves work that's happening that you can't see. And why is that the case? It's because the data being pulled in from all your senses is way too detailed to be useful. Your retina at the back of your eye, that transmits visual input at about 10 million bits per second. Which is similar to an Ethernet connection. But if you had conscious access to all that data, you wouldn't be able to operate at your level of space and time. At your level, what you care about is, where the heck did I put my toothbrush? Or what can I read on this menu? Or where is my friend's face in this crowd of people? You just want simple, high-level answers to important questions. You want the abstractions, not the details. So your brain takes in enormous amounts of data, but what you want is the headline. In Silicon Valley, where I live, for example, all my venture capitalist friends talk about this as pattern matching. They have thousands of new companies coming in to give them pitches, and in each of those pitches, there are a million details that they can't know, but they think, in my career, I've seen all these pitches and patterns emerge. And I don't even know why I sometimes feel like wow, this team of founders is really great, or this team of founders is never going to make it, even though the idea seems strong. So those assessments rely on their intuition. And what they're trying to do is make their intuition good and refine it with practice. So in many situations in all of our lives, we have lots of practice at something, and we see a new situation and we make an assessment like yes or no, or good or bad, or take it or leave it. And the extraordinary thing about brains is that they can summarize a complex situation and say, look, although there are a million details here, the big picture is that you should approach that or avoid that. And you rarely have access to the details about why. Sometimes you might think you have access, but that is often just a retrospective story. Now, in neuroscience jargon, we call this unconscious inference, meaning you are inferring something about the situation and you're not doing it consciously, presumably because of the amount of data that is involved. And in popular parlance, we call this intuition. But intuition sometimes gets a bad name because it's often hijacked by spiritual guru types who say you should always trust your intuition. Now, here's the truth. You should not always trust your intuition. After all, your intuition is not a perfect predictor. In Silicon Valley, for example, 4 out of 10 companies that are backed by those venture capitalists, they lose money or they go bankrupt. And many times, the intuitive decisions that we make, let's say about relationships, turn out to be bad decisions. Just because the computations are happening under the hood and they're vast and complex, it doesn't mean they're guaranteed to be correct. Intuition is quite often wrong or makes a decision based on things that you wouldn't feel proud of doing if you had access to it. For example, what if your intuition tells you not to sell your house to this guy, but it's because of some deep down unconscious racism that you weren't even aware of? What if your intuition tells you that there's something creepy about that guy over there and you don't want to do business with him? And you say, look, I'm just trusting my gut on this one. But it turns out the poor guy has early Parkinson's disease. And so as a result, he's unable to make expressive facial expressions. And instead, his face is mostly blank. And that creeps you out because you don't get what's happening because, let's say, you're not a clinician. Or what if you're sitting on a jury and you think there's something about this guy that makes me feel like he should be put away for a long time? But it turns out it's because he's not handsome, but ugly. There's an extensive literature on this, that ugly people get longer sentences than good-looking people. So the idea that we should always trust our intuition turns out to be mistaken. But the good news is, it turns out that we can be a little bit smarter about when to look to our intuition or ignore it. Researchers have been working to figure out the circumstances under which your intuition might be more trustworthy or less trustworthy. So for this, I decided to have a conversation with my friend and colleague, Joel Pearson. Joel's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. He's recently written a book about this called The Intuition Toolkit. So Joel and I sat down together to dig into this topic. Joel, tell us about intuition.
Yeah, so a topic I love. We've been studying it for over a decade now, and I've recently just published a book, The Intuition Toolkit. So a decade ago, we started looking at the landscape of intuition, and people define it as a spiritual thing. Other people in psychology and neuroscience define it very, very differently. And you have all these different definitions. So I wanted to come up with a clear definition, the most practical, and what I think is the most useful definition, and that is the productive, learnt use of unconscious information for better decisions and actions.
By the way, does intuition always give better decision making? Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
That's how So this was part of the problem. So I'm gonna introduce a couple of words. So
Great.
This is what I did at the beginning. I came up with another word called misintuition. Right? I know it sounds like a Miss Universe contest, but it's not. I wanted a word so I wanted to sort of split apart the misfiring of intuition when it goes wrong, because there are times when you should absolutely not use it, and other times where it is useful. So I wanted to split that apart and came up with this other word, misintuition and intuition. So that's why I define intuition as the productive use, right, of unconscious information and it's learned, right? So we can't, we'll get to in a second, I'm sure, but you can only use intuition really for something you have experience with, and that turns out to be important.
So give us more of a sense of this then.
Yeah, so the example I like to give is you walk into a cafe, right? And at the second you walk through the door, your brain's processing 1,000 different things, right? The music, what the staff are wearing, if there's tablecloths, no tablecloths, the temperature, how clean the floor is, like smells, hundreds of things, and you're not consciously aware of them all, right? And as you walk in, you're going to go, yeah, let's get coffee here, or let's go across the road to the other place, right? And that people are going to sometimes will report as they don't know why, but there's just something off that they felt sometimes in the gut, right? The gut response. So that's kind of the way I tend to introduce intuition. And what's happening in those few seconds, the second as you walk in the door, is that things in the environment are triggering positive or negative associations. And that is based on past learning, right? The classic Pavlov's dogs, classical conditioning, right? So you go to enough cafes where it's really hot in there and there's bad music and the coffee's terrible, your brain will learn that. Whether you consciously remember that or not, your brain will start to learn these associations, right? If you get food poisoning and sick, it's going to learn it really quickly. And so you go to enough cafes, you go to hundreds or thousands, your brain will learn which cues in the environment predict good or bad food or coffee. And that's what's happening. So all the things in the environment are triggering red flag, green flag, right? And you feel it and you don't know why, right? And you either get the coffee or you go somewhere else.
Yes.
So that's, I think, the best way to think about it.
Cool. And this is why I think about intuition sometimes is just having a wide angle lens on the camera. There's a lot of interest in neuroscience, obviously, about cognition, where you're deciding, okay, what's the next chess move here and so on. And that's what lots of AI is about, is how do I make a really smart decision here? But in a sense with intuition, it's, I'm going to take in the whole cafe and, something's going to bubble up saying go or stay. So I'm really interested in this issue of misintuition, though, because, as you phrase it, because there are lots of times that people have intuitions that are totally incorrect. Like, oh, this coffee shop, there's something that creeps me out about like the guy in the corner there, I feel like he's a mass murderer, even though maybe the guy has, something like Parkinson's disease, where people have, blank facial expressions. I've seen this a bunch of times where someone has Parkinson's and other people think, oh my gosh, that guy's creepy. There's something wrong with that guy, because they don't know about it, right? Okay, so give us a sense of misintuition and how, when you feel like, is intuition mostly right, mostly wrong, totally random?
So I'm glad you asked. So the second half of the book, it unpacks based on these 5 rules, and I use the acronym SMILE, so people can try and remember this, right? So the first half of the book is really about the science we've done in the lab, how you measure it, how you create it in the lab. And it's not always good. Sometimes you should use it, sometimes you shouldn't. And that's what the rules unpack. So they sort of tell people when it's safe to trust their intuition. And an example of this I give often is Steve Jobs, who is talked about using his intuition at Apple, both for product design and running the company and all different, and he was a master at it. He went to India and studied it. He was really into it. When it came to his health decisions later in life and some of his other decisions, not so much, right? And that's interesting because...
Wait, can you unpack that for people who don't know about his health decisions?
So he died from cancer in the end, and he actually, his doctors and his family wanted him to get treatment, to get an operation, and he said no. He didn't want to have that sort of be invaded surgically like that, and he put off the treatment, put it off until it was basically too late. And this idea that intuition is specific to a particular environment or context. And it makes sense because the learning that I'm saying that it seems to be based on is context specific. And this is one of those rules. This is actually the E at the end of SMILE for environment. So if you learn it at, you craft your intuition expertly at work, when you go home, when you're on holiday, in a different context, different environment, that learning is not going to apply so well. So we need to be careful when we change the environment, because when you learn something, the environment gets sort of attached to that, right? When you're studying for the exam in your bedroom, not only are you learning all the information, you're learning the information imprinted to your bedroom. So we have to be careful with that. So that's an example of where you could be led astray. Now, S at the beginning of SMILE is self-awareness, and that really is a trigger for emotions. So we shouldn't trust our intuition when we're emotional, when we're stressed, anxious, or depressed, for a number of reasons. For something called arousal misattribution, which is something, so humans are not very good at understanding where particular feelings or stress or emotion come from. And this is we can deep dive into this. There's classic experiments in psychology that, and now a lot of data to support this, right? But basically, if there was a snake right here on the floor, we'd both get adrenaline and we'd both be sweating and scared of the snake. And then later on, we confuse that and say, man, that podcast was amazing, right? We'd confuse the emotion for this situation with the emotion from the snake. We're just bad at understanding the source of these things. So that's the number one rule. If you're emotional, stressed, don't follow your intuition. Just put it aside, follow the logic as best you can.
Nice.
Right, so that's S. Then M is for mastery. And that we mentioned learning before. So that's really that you need to build the associations in your brain between the environment, the triggers, and good or bad outcomes. So you've never played chess before. You can't sit down and just be a grandmaster, intuitive chess player, right? Your brain needs to learn the associations between patterns, outcomes, what's good, what's bad. Likewise for anything. So you need to sort of put the time in and build that experience. How much experience? 10,000 hours? Not so much. We don't know, right? Depends how emotional things are, right? We know that something like PTSD, you can learn something very strong, in a moment. If it's just good or bad coffee, it's going to take a lot of learning, a lot of iterations. But if something's highly emotional, then you'll learn it very, very quickly. So you need to have experience with that. And now it's a really interesting one. I is really for impulses, but also addiction. So I started hearing from people that things that have an addictive nature, so your alcohol, drugs, but also social media, checking your email, so behavioral addictions, people have this urge, this strong pull towards them. And they can confuse that or call it intuition. But I didn't want that to be part of intuition. I think that's something a little bit different. So one of the rules is just to stay clear of anything that's addictive and don't confuse that with intuition, right? Including food. And that's a controversial one because there's a whole movement of intuitive eating, which is a hot topic. We can deep dive into it.
What is that movement?
So there's a whole idea, there's all these books on intuitive eating, and this is this idea that you just follow how you feel about the food, right? You just eat as much as you want, whenever you want, and your body will naturally come to an equilibrium, more or less, right? I'm summarizing it. The problem is modern food's highly engineered, right? Billions of dollars going into making food basically like a drug, addictive. And that's a very dangerous thing. I'm against that idea. Unless you're out in the country and you're eating a whole food diet, then maybe that can work. And then L is for low probability, but it's for anything around probabilities and numbers, right? So psychology textbooks are full of examples where people just get these probability tests and it's completely wrong, right? Our brains just don't process numbers very well, or probabilities particularly. And so again, anything around probabilities and numbers, stay away from intuition. Right? Just don't use your intuition for anything around numbers.
Right. As in, I don't want to drive over the bridge because I've seen lots of stories of bridges collapsing.
Yeah.
In fact, it's terribly low probability, but people get scared. They get the gut feeling of not wanting to do that. Is that an example?
Absolutely, yeah. So I live in Sydney. Sometimes I'll call it the shark attack rule, right? Yeah. Where there's sharks, I think you're more likely to get this for an Aussie stat, more likely to be injured by a kangaroo than a shark, right? And certainly more likely to be hurt in a car crash than a shark. But people don't think twice about getting in the car or patting a kangaroo, but they'll be, once you start imagining a shark's, in the water, then you get really scared of it. So for a range of different reasons, we're just not good at following the numbers and probabilities. Emotions, other things creep in. So anything around that, don't follow the feelings, don't follow intuition, stick with the numbers and the probabilities.
One example of that here in Silicon Valley is with self-driving cars. The probabilities of self-driving cars are terrific, as in you're much less likely to get in an accident with those. But there's something about control and the other emotions involved there that make it so that people just can't do it. They'd rather have a much higher risk drive than do something safe.
Yeah, it's a funny, it's an odd thing.
So the L is, what is the advice to people though, that if it's a low probability event, don't try.
Anything around probabilities, smoking, climate change, or anything around numbers and probabilities, don't feel it. Don't follow the numbers, do the math, just follow whatever the numbers say. Don't try and feel your way through it, right? And then E was the environment, the one so I mentioned before with Steve Jobs. That the learning is context and environment specific. So when you're on holiday, right? I'm in a different country now. I looked to the wrong side, and I feel like I should look to the right, and right, but the car's coming from the left here in America. And there are all, there's all kinds of very subtle things like that when you're traveling that I have to really pay attention to not just do my usual intuitive thing and sort of go back to sort of first principles and think logically about what I'm doing. So that's SMILE. There are these 5 rules that fall out of the science around intuition.
And just out of curiosity, why did you call it SMILE instead of miles or slime?
My wife helped me with that. In all honesty, she came up with that. I wanted something positive because a lot of the rules that don't do this don't use your intuition. Like I like the idea of smile before you intuit, smile before you use your intuition, and the idea that of people to have a daily practice and getting really used to those rules, like going to the gym or something and practicing. Right, I suggest people have a sort of an intuition practice diary or a table where they'll keep track of things and learn to use it. So one of the things like people, small decisions, they may not use intuition. When they're going to get married or get divorced or change or live somewhere else, move overseas or a new job or leave a job, all of a sudden they start talking about, oh, my gut says this, I'm feeling it this way or that way. And they're not well practiced at following these kind of rules. They might be feeling highly anxious, right? And their intuition's not going to work when they're anxious. So I like the idea of starting with small decisions and working up to the larger ones.
That's excellent. That's so good because people write about intuition, and I feel like they often give way too much credit to intuition. So what you're doing is so important to say, look, here are the times to listen to it, here are the times not to listen to it, because you might drift into the realm of misintuition there, which people do all the time. And obviously people with anxieties about things or misapprehensions about things, including, whatever it is. Maybe they're divorced from reality or they just overrepresent something. People will often follow their gut, but incorrectly. And so this is a really important thing that you're doing here.
If you're anxious about flying and getting on the plane, it's probably not your intuition telling you something's going to happen. Unless, you're a mechanic, an airline mechanic and you're an expert, right? It's not that. It's just your anxiety. So don't confuse the two.
How do you measure this in the lab?
Yeah, so we started off on this quest almost a decade ago now. Well, actually, no, a decade. So we had this sort of rough definition of intuition, and we've been studying consciousness. So we do a lot of consciousness research in my lab, and we have ways of rendering things unconscious. What do I mean by that? So we have a way to show people a picture in one eye and then flash bright colors in the other eye, and that can render that picture completely unconscious. So it's kind of like just me doing this, right? I see you in this eye and my hand there.
For the audio audience, he's covering his one of his eyes, yes.
So if you're on YouTube, so that puts the visual system into this binocular rivalry, this state of competition, right? And if the thing in the other eye is bright enough and you make it flicker, you'll never see the picture in the other eye.
So wait, let me just unpack this, which is that you've got two eyes. They normally fuse their picture so you see the world. But in fact, you can, in the laboratory, give a stimulus to one eye and a different stimulus to the other eye, and you can have them compete. And by doing this cleverly, you can make it so that the input going into one eye, you're not conscious of, even though your visual system still sees it just fine.
Exactly, yeah. So I call this inception. And we do it with emotional images. I call it emotional inception, like the Christopher Nolan film, right? So we're not hacking dreams or anything, but we're getting, and this is what we need. This is like the ingredients you need if you want to study intuition. How can you get something into the brain and it's unconscious? And this is a way of doing that. So what we do is we show people sort of nasty images, snakes, spiders, sharks, guns, these kind of things in one eye, and we have a bright flickering stimulus to the other eye. And so they never see the scary image, but we know their brain is processing it. We can put a little thing around their finger and we can see that they start sweating a little bit more in those conditions when there's an emotional thing there. So we know it is being processed. So that's the first ingredient. The second ingredient, there needs to be a decision, right? It's decision making. So at the same time, we have this noisy cloud of dots just moving all over the place on the screen, a bit like the old school analog TVs, right? There's that fuzzy snow. So a bit like that, but it's slightly drifting left or right a little bit more, but it's kind of hard to pick if it's going left or right. So it's super simple. All people have to do is say, oh, it's going left. That's it. That's the end of a trial. Then we do it again and again. And so they don't know we're doing this, but at the same time, they're deciding whether it's moving left or right. We're showing them a positive or a negative image. And then what we see over time is their brain starts to associate the positive or negative with the direction, and their performance starts to go up. They get better and better at it, right? Their reaction times get faster and faster. So their accuracy goes up. Their responses are faster. And if you ask them how confident they are, their confidence goes up as well, right? And then if you give them a questionnaire and say, how do you make decisions in everyday life, outside the lab, the people that report making more intuitive decisions are much better, or they get more of a boost from these unconscious images. So I know to a lot of people, they're like, what? This is kind of a strange way to measure intuition. And it is, but I think it's an interesting sort of technology and a way to measure and dissect something in the lab so we can understand it, right? So, but it is different to how a lot of people may think about intuition.
And tell us about intuition and AI.
Yeah, so at the end of the book, in the very last, the last chapter, I start talking about this. And it's something that came up early, and journalists would ask this question. And I realized that the way I'm defining it, right, unconscious learning, things in the world become associated with positive or negative outcomes in your brain, unconscious learning. That's kind of how these new versions of AI operate, right? We don't think they're conscious. And they're learning. So they're unconscious learning, and they're learning to this thing predicts this thing, positive or negative outcome. So there's something interesting between those two that it's just a nice parallel there. And that's interesting in itself. The second is the question of, will we be able to outsource our intuition to an AI assistant, right? And could we, as we have all these wearables, and we're going to get a lot more of them soon, could the AI use all these wearables to basically tell us what our intuition is saying, right? So can we outsource it? And this, would be interesting to everyone, but it would be interesting to certain populations who don't have people with mental disorders, and addiction is one interesting area where we know decision-making doesn't work that well in people that have an addiction, and intuition certainly doesn't work. So could you outsource intuition to an AI, your personal AI assistant? I think it's a really fascinating question.
So we're actually doing something at my company, Neuroscience, which is an interesting version of this. So just as one example, there were some students at USC who took the wristband, and for people with autism who have a hard time reading the emotional state of the person they're talking to, the wristband listens in real time and makes a machine learning decision. Oh, the person is happy, sad, angry, things like that. And then just buzzes to tell you in different ways. Oh, that person. So if you're a kid with autism who can't read that, you're just being told the answer to that.
And do you see learning? Do they get better as they learn?
So I don't know yet, but presumably because you're just telling them like, hey, this guy's angry, so adjust your behavior appropriately. So it's just a memorization thing. But I'll give you another example. Something we did is we got these smartwatches that measure heart rate and heart rate variability and galvanic skin response and so on. And we use the API to take that data out and feed it into this wristband that vibrates in different ways so that these invisible states of your body can become visible to you. So you can actually feel, oh, it's not this thing that is making, it's not the cafe's fault, but it's that I drank too much coffee earlier, or whatever the issue is. You can start actually reading these signals from your bodies in ways that are typically invisible to us. I'll tell you the really interesting experiment we did, which is we fed that data through the internet to the wristband. And the reason we did that is so that, for example, your spouse could wear the watch and you're wearing the vibrating wristband. So you're feeling your spouse's physiology. So when she's feeling nervous or stressed or things like that, even if you're on the other side of the world.
I love it. Shortcut the argument. But this must have an application for, emotional intelligence and emotional awareness. So some people don't have good emotional awareness. They're not aware when they're angry or stressed, right? So this is part of that first rule for using intuition. People just don't realize when they're stressed or anxious. But this could be a really interesting way of sort of training people up in this self-awareness of their own physiology. Yeah. I like it.
I think about this all the time. I just heard a statistic this morning. I don't know if it's true or but it's truthy though, but which is that 85% of the jobs that will exist when our kids are adults don't even exist yet. And so who knows if the number's exactly right, but it strikes me as, wow, what a world we're entering into. But in this context, the world of maybe everyone's just going to have the opportunity to be much more emotionally intelligent because we'll all tap into this stuff and get these signals and know, because my, Apple Vision Pro glasses or something will say, hey, Eagleman, your heart rate's going up, your galvanic skin response is spiking. And I'll say, oh, okay, I wouldn't have known that, but now, thank goodness I'm being told that.
Yeah.
Piece of cake.
I hope so, because there's data showing that emotional intelligence has actually gone down over the last decade. And it's been linked to tech use. So it's hard to pull out the causation here, but there's some data suggesting that the more young people use tech, the lower their emotional intelligence. Anyway.
Well, good. So we'll rescue it with tech
I
then.
think so, yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Cool. Yeah, I think this, as you and I study our whole careers, the brain is this entire cosmos happening in there. There's so much information that you're picking up from the world that you have no access to. We are so low bandwidth in terms of our conscious understanding of any of this stuff. But because the data is in there, it should be extractable. And what that means is that what intuition becomes in 15 years is maybe, you'll write a sequel to the book with this new world.
But interoception, right? That's kind of what it is. You can think of it as our bodies, our physiology tapping in. So our bodies have this access to the unconscious information in our brains, which sounds like a funny way to put it. Our bodies get access to something we don't, if we is our consciousness. But it kind of does. So by tapping into your gut response, your heart rate, if you're sweating or not, you're getting this extra source of information, the unconscious. And it's kind of like that. It's this sort of using interoception, this internal perceptual state of the body, to get access to extra information. And who wouldn't want that if we can trust it?
Exactly, because maybe you can think of an example. I'm not thinking of one off the top of my head where we confuse our emotional state or intuition about what's, we misinterpret what's happening. You gave the example before of if there's a snake on the floor and then later we think, wow, that was a really exciting podcast, but we're conflating some things. I mean, it is a very exciting podcast, but
a great story from the book is I went on a date before I got married, and it was a first date, and we went rock climbing, one of those indoor rock climbing gyms, right? And we're climbing and falling and belaying, and then we swap, and it's exciting. It's like, whoa, and it was like the chemistry is amazing. And next time we meet up, it's like, not so much. Turns out we were not suited for each other at all. And I was like, but it felt so amazing that first date. And it puzzled me for years. And then I was like, arousal misattribution. That's exactly what's going on. All the adrenaline from the falling and the climbing, we thought it was coming from each other, and it wasn't. So, yeah.
Right. Aren't there these studies where you have people crossing a rope bridge over a cliff and you have the female assistant with the clipboard who asks the person questions while they're on the rope bridge, and then later the question is something about like, hey, would you like to get her number and go on a date? Something like that, versus the exact same assistant with the same clipboard asking the same questions, but in a boring situation on campus. Yes, it's the same thing.
Exactly. The rickety bridge experiment. It's very famous, rickety bridge experiment. And that people just confuse these feelings of adrenaline from the height with the person in front of them.
Yes, so we're entering a very exciting future as we get better sensors and better AI being able to essentially summarize things and tell them to our low bandwidth conscious mind and just say, hey, pal, here's how you're feeling. Don't confuse this. So maybe you'll have to add another letter to your SMILE acronym.
I think absolutely, David. I think the things we can measure now, this is like a passion of mine in my labs, is measuring things in the mind that we thought were too hard to measure, right? And I call it like a blood test for the mind. We want objective, reliable measurements of mental things, like a blood test that we can rely on. When you interview someone, give them a questionnaire, it's good, but it's not that reliable. We need these objective tests. It's a different way of thinking about tech and technology, but it can be done now. We can do this now.
The book is The Intuition Toolkit. And thank you so much for being here, Joel.
Oh, pleasure, David. And before we go, I want to say thank you for inspiring me with expanding what academia can be and writing books and TV shows and companies and all the cool things you do. I think it's groundbreaking in that you're breaking open the classic academic model. So thank you.
Thank you, Joel. So that was Joel Pearson talking about his new book, The Intuition Toolkit. And now I want to bring it back to the big picture. I'm always struck by how much we do at the unconscious level that we don't have access to. And a couple of episodes ago, I was talking with Ed Catmull, who's the founder of Pixar Films. And one of the topics we touched on in our conversation, but which I didn't include in that episode, was this topic of intuition, the kind of intuition that an animator might have. So here's a short clip from that conversation with Ed's thoughts about that.
The ability to animate means you understand motion and emotion, and you're observing things and you're conveying things at a subconscious level. And that's not really a visualization element. I know in the case of our brains is that we take a lot of subtle clues, but we're taking them unconsciously. So the way we move our face or our lips or our body motion we're kind of aware that we convey information to our body, but we don't know exactly what that is or how we do it. If you actually understand how important that is, then a good animator will sort of get that and see it and then convey it. If they put it in the animation, then people will see it and they'll get information at this level, not knowing that they're getting it. I mean, one of my favorite examples in Toy Story 2, where Jessie, the doll, was very upset because her owner had actually discarded her. But while she was talking, she was taking her pigtail and she was twisting it. Almost nobody would notice that she was twisting her pigtail. They wouldn't notice at a conscious level. But at an unconscious level, that would mean that she's really torn up inside, along with the other things that are there. So we've got different levels of getting information from the world. There's the direct words we're saying, and sometimes the direct words we're saying are the opposite of what we really mean. And so you've got, that's one level, and the other is the body motion conveying something. That whole process means that the animator is observing these different levels and putting them into the character. And of course, the actor also provides layers to that. And when you get all of that right, you have something which is complex and is interesting. It's observing multiple levels and isn't just about the pictures. It's about all of this coming together.
That was Ed Catmull, founder of Pixar Films, talking about the intuition that's needed for an animator. Sometimes they can consciously articulate what they're up to, and sometimes they can't. But for a good animator, they pick up on those cues and they transmit those cues, sometimes all under the radar of consciousness. And of course, these animators are working on areas where their intuition makes good sense because they have mastered their data and they're working in familiar and predictable contexts. So let's wrap up for today. Intuition is about putting together vast information that your brain has picked up on to give you a final nudge in one direction or another. And it's massively important for our functioning in the world. But we shouldn't romanticize it to believe that it's always correct and always to be listened to. Instead, we need to be clever about when to trust it and under what circumstances. As Joel suggests, we need to take into account whether we're feeling too emotional, in which case, don't trust your intuition. You need to master data before trusting your intuition on something. Don't mistake impulse as an addiction for intuition. Don't use your intuition for very low probability judgments. And you should really only trust your intuition in familiar and predictable contexts. In the end, each of us carries vast computational resources comparable to Google or Meta or Apple, but instead of it weighing 8 ounces and us carrying in our back pocket, we have 3 pounds of this computational material and we lug it around on our shoulders the way that we carry other things that are heavy and important. This is all you have to make your decisions in the world. And think about it this way. In the same way that you might tell a student how to leverage the computational might of the internet while retaining appropriate skepticism about some of the results, so it goes with the massive networked biological landscape of our own brains. It is up to us to learn how to become good users. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion, and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.